The dust is settling on the historic ruling from the UK Supreme Court on Wednesday about the legal definition of a woman. Organisations are starting to react to what it might mean in practice. We will discuss some of those reactions on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and the first half of this episode of Newscast, we're going to look at the continuing fallout from the ruling by the UK Supreme Court on Wednesday about the meaning of a woman in the Equality Act 2010. And this was the result of a case that was brought against the Scottish Government because the Scottish Government passed some legislation through the Scottish Parliament about women on company boards, and they used the definition of woman to include a trans woman who had obtained a gender recognition certificate. That was challenged by a campaign group, and those campaigners were celebrating yesterday because the UK Supreme Court sided with them and said that when the UK's Equality Act 2010 talks about sex and talks about a woman, it is referring to biological sex. Now, the issue with this story is that ruling from the Supreme Court is quite clear. What's less obvious, though, is how public bodies, employers, other institutions will actually implement that ruling in their policies. We got a bit of a clue, though, today about the way forward from the head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Baroness Faulkner, who did a quite important interview on the Today programme. So we will talk about all the things we've learnt in the last 24 hours, because returning to Newscast is the BBC's social affairs editor, Alison Holt. Hi, Alison.
Hello, nice to be back with you.
Thanks for coming back. And because there's an NHS angle, Hugh Pym, health editor, is here. Hello, Hugh.
Hi, Adam. Pleased to be here.
Right. We're still in this period. Let's make this clear now where, okay, the judgment landed on Wednesday. The judgment was very clear. Lots of people said this brings us clarity. But actually, Alison, as we were discussing on the last episode, this is the middle of a process, not the end of a process. There's still a lot of things to find out about how this judgment will impact the real world and real people.
Yes, there is. I mean, the judgment does give us that clarity in terms of basically the definition of a woman, what it means to be a woman. But what we haven't had is the detail of how that will work in practical terms, because that will be down to the guidance which will be written by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. We do have a bit more detail or clarity on that than we had when we spoke this time yesterday. And that's come from the chair of the commission, who has basically said that she feels that the judgment is what it says, that it means that if a woman-only space exists, then it is for biological women only. It is not. That does not include trans women, and that she was very clear on that. She said that in terms of sport, that meant in women's categories, trans women could not compete, and continued along those lines. And I think the clarity of what she was saying was also quite unexpected, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the person you're talking about there, Alison, is Baroness Faulkner, who is chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She was appointed under the last government, and actually she, for quite some time, has been talking along the same lines as the Supreme Court found on Wednesday.
Yes, and she today described it as the judgment as a victory for common sense, and that she felt it gave that clarity, that they'd actually been involved in the Supreme Court case, and one of the things they had said was the way the law was working at the moment, with that inconsistency over what was meant by a woman, and that was causing real problems in when it came to regulating and enforcing things like single-sex spaces. So she's got that clarity now, and she really spelt it out in terms of saying we will be looking at policies, we will be looking at what different organisations are doing and whether or not they are going to meet this very clear guidance.
And she said one thing that I can imagine trans activist groups being quite annoyed about. She said when it comes to toilets in a workplace, trans people could use their advocacy, in other words, lobbying their employer for a third set of bathrooms that would not be single sex, so alongside the male and the female toilets. Now, on one hand, I can see why trans people would be annoyed by that. But on the other hand, the Equality Act from 2010, which is the piece of legislation we're talking about here, already gave organisations, institutions, the power to, as you were explaining, have a single-sex space that did not include trans people, as long as that was done for a legitimate aim and was a proportionate thing to do. And so in that sense, that's actually sort of not changed. The law has stayed the same, as we were discussing yesterday.
Yeah, and that's what the guidance written in 2022 says, that when sex is talked about in terms of single-sex spaces, it's talking about biological sex. So in a sense, the judgment reaffirmed what was the existing law, but as we know, there has been so much debate and discussion and different organisations interpreting things slightly differently, that what the judgment has done is it set that firm line in the ground and said, this is what it means and this is what you need to adhere to.
And this is when we get to the NHS, and this is what Baroness Faulkner from the Equality and Human Rights Commission said about the NHS and how they will behave going forward. She was speaking to Nick Robinson on the Today programme on Thursday morning.
We've been speaking to the health service for actually an inordinately long time, and they keep telling us they're going to produce new guidance. I think we will now be asking them when they expect to produce that new guidance. They now have clarity. There is no confusion as of yesterday at 10:30 in the morning. They can start to implement the new legal reasoning and produce their exceptions forthwith.
But they have to change it, do they? Because they have a document, the NHS guidance, that says trans people should be accommodated according to the way they dress, their name, their pronouns. That is no longer the case. That has to change.
Yes, that's correct.
And you will pursue it if it doesn't change.
Yes, we will. We will be having conversations with them to update that guidance.
So Hugh, there's two things there. There's a process thing about the time frame, and then there's actually what the guidance says and potentially will say. Which one do you want to take first?
Well, I think picking up on Baroness Faulkner's comments there, she's saying basically it has to change now because that's what the Supreme Court ruling is very clear about. But speaking to NHS England, their comment is very, very nuanced and a little bit cautious, maybe because they need more time to react. So NHS England have said there's a review of current guidance on same-sex accommodation, and as part of this process, there will be consideration of all relevant legislation and ruling. And just to remind you what the guidance is, it goes back to September 2019 and states that trans people should be accommodated according to their presentation, the way they dress and the name and pronouns they currently use. So that clearly is what Baroness Faulkner's referring to. And the question is, how long will it take to actually adjust that? She did go on to say that she'd been in regular dialogue, as we've been hearing, with the NHS. To be clear, there've been no statements yet from the governments in Scotland and Wales on how the Supreme Court ruling might affect the NHS in those nations.
But the thing is, there's no clue there from the NHS about when there's going to be any action. But what Baroness Faulkner was suggesting there was that she's prepared to apply some pressure, and she's quite an advocate for these things. She's prepared to go on the airwaves and call people out as she sees it.
Exactly, and she said she'd pursue them. And Karen Smith, the Health and Care Minister covering England, had said that the NHS would have to comply along with other public sector bodies, though she did say some homework was needed to see how this would be applied in practice. Now, that doesn't seem to be suggesting that the Department of Health think it should be acted on immediately. And of course, the debates about single-sex wards, but talking to NHS sources, also changing rooms for staff. Clearly, nurses and other clinicians and doctors need to change into their scrubs and so on. So that whole issue of a third space has been raised, as mentioned earlier. But hospitals are a very crowded place. It's very busy. So there's a lot of practicalities around implementing all this.
And also, we should remember that different bits of the NHS are managed by different organisations. And okay, we've talked about NHS England being abolished and Wes Streeting taking on the functions. But the NHS is quite a devolved organisation across the country, isn't it? So you could have quite a patchwork of how different places deal with this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the debate today, following Baroness Faulkner's comments and this guidance, has been about wards, same-sex accommodation, wards in hospitals. But clearly, GP practices will have something to think about with consulting rooms and so on. You've got different NHS employers and different trusts in the community. It is being made clear, though, that with A&E, the priority was and will remain the sickest patients, whatever gender they are. So that has been made clear that A&E is not covered by all this debate.
There was also a bit of clarity from the British Transport Police. They put out a statement on Thursday afternoon saying that if a trans woman needs to be searched, that search will be done by a male British Transport Police officer. So that's an organisation that's kind of doing something quite concrete, although they say that's an interim measure, so it might not last forever. Alison, is there anything else you want to bring to us that's happened in the last 24 hours that will help us understand the world we're in now?
Well, I suppose it is about the Equality Commission's guidance. They're saying they're looking at the implications of the ruling at pace, because they know that organisations need to know what it means in practical terms. So they are putting together, they were already doing this, but they're going to update it in terms of the implications of the ruling. They're going to publish their code of conduct, their code of practice, which is statutory, so it has legal powers. They expect to do that by the summer. So some of those answers about how this works in practice should be provided by that. The other thing I think I should say is that it's that reminder that one of the things that the ruling said was that the Equality Act also provides protections for trans people, and that those protections need to be looked after in terms of, not discriminating, no harassment, etc., etc. So it's emphasising that point again, that there are protections there for trans people.
Yeah, we got an example of that actually in the Supreme Court ruling, or at least in the documents that came with the Supreme Court ruling yesterday, which was that if a trans woman feels she's being discriminated against in the workplace on, say, pay on a gendered basis, a trans woman is still allowed to use the Equality Act to protect herself.
Yeah, exactly that. That's one of the examples that Baroness Faulkner also used, that in that situation, if someone's being discriminated against, no question, this is something which the Act is there to protect them from.
Alison, thank you very much. Oh, Hugh, you've actually just raised your hand. It's very polite for Newscast. You've got one final point to make.
Yeah, only to go back to this legal issue, the ongoing legal possibilities and challenges, that there is this ongoing case, NHS 5, where a nurse, Sandy Peggy, was suspended after complaining about sharing a changing room with a transgender medic. That medic alleged bullying and harassment. That is ongoing, and there's already been a bit of media comment about how that might develop, that action, in the light of this ruling.
And also that's a reminder of what we were saying previously, that a lot of this is developed through other avenues other than Parliament or the Supreme Court. It's things like employment tribunals or organisations coming up with their own policies. So Hugh, thanks to you too.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Now, Donald Trump's all-purpose international envoy, Steve Witkoff, has been in Paris today, along with the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, for talks about Ukraine with the French President, Emmanuel Macron, accompanied by the UK's National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell. So, what's the significance of this meeting? And actually, is the fact that the meeting's happening at all maybe more important than what they discuss? The man who knows is BBC's diplomatic correspondent and friend of Newscast, James Landale, who is here. Hello, James.
Hello, Adam.
Last time I saw you in person, you were about to head to Ukraine. And last time I spoke to you, you were in Ukraine. So do you have some reflections having got back? I know you weren't expecting to talk about what you did on your foreign deployment, but...
I think that the two things I got, one was a sense of realism in Kyiv. They are aware that they're facing an uphill diplomatic task at the moment. They're fairly confident about the military front. They're holding their own in the east, but the repeated uptick in Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities is having an impact. It is a reflection of the fact that they have fewer air defences than they had before, and that they are really struggling with that now. But equally, I think there's still an astonishing resilience that. I went into the presidential palace a couple of times to see, various stages, see various people, and when you go there through the security, they've still got the sandbags in the front of the main hall, which were there, put there at the beginning of the war when they didn't know what was going to happen. But the point is that those sandbag walls are still there. They're still there with their firing points. Maybe it's symbolic, or maybe they will be there, but it's a symbol of whatever happens, that's where the Ukrainians were prepared to fight, down to that last building. That would be their Alamo. And so I think that resilience is still there.
And can you feel the kind of the big global politics that happen elsewhere? Can you feel it having an impact there?
Oh, yeah, because they're gripped by it, because it has such an impact on them. And so they follow it immensely closely. Everybody, in the old days, we used to talk about Kremlinology, sort of looking at sort of photographs of sort of Soviet leaders and working
who was up, who was down.
Well, I don't know what the word is for Trumpology, but everybody's constantly studying the White House and who's sitting where, who's up, who's down. Every word that the president utters in those rambling sort of Oval Office performances that happened on an almost daily basis, every word is parsed and weighted and assessed to see, which way the wind is blowing. Because the point is, however many diplomats you've got, the only person who really matters is Donald Trump. If you talk to, a lot of sort of non-American diplomats, they say, look, there's nobody else to talk to. Because there's nobody in the State Department. They haven't appointed any assistant secretaries. Right. And there's a question mark about how much influence Marco Rubio has. And so it all has to be, what is in the mind of the decision maker in chief on a daily basis.
Which makes me think this meeting in Paris today, it might be important in its own terms, but it also might be a bit of a sideshow at the same time. What's your take on what's actually happening today?
I think the fact that Steve Witkoff is there matters because he is Donald Trump's voice on earth. He is the man who has the direct ear to the president and reflects the president's views. And if you talk to American diplomats, they sort of say, that Mr. Witkoff doesn't have a massive great staff. There's not some great bureaucracy behind him that's recording meetings and feeding back and shuffling paper and moving things around like that. It's literally him and the president sort of downloading, well, I saw Putin and he said this and I said that and like that. And then, what do you want me to do now? So in other words, it's very much a kind of sort of Witkoff-Trump exercise without a sort of a massive machine. And the American machine behind it, a pretty stunned, bruised American government machine is trying to work out what's going to come next. And so I think the fact that Mr. Witkoff is in Paris matters because he is, he goes straight to the president. I think the fact that he is sat next door to Marco Rubio is also significant because it does show finally an attempt by the Americans to join everything up. Because another complaint you'd hear from European diplomats and others is that, you get one message from, state and another from the White House, and there was a sense that they weren't really talking to one another. I think the fact that they're sat down at the same table, hearing the same messages from the Europeans means that that'll be fed back into the system now. So the government, i.e. the State Department, will what was noticeable today is that at those meetings, there were note takers there, there were officials. So this will be a formal thing. Transcripts will go back to various parties and capitals. Everybody will negotiate and discuss what went on. In other words, sort of normal diplomacy.
Yeah. So what is Macron trying to convey across that table then?
Oh, if you talk to any of the Europeans, they say, look, it's just put more pressure on the Russians. Don't take them at face value. The evidence on the ground in Ukraine shows that they're not serious about peace at the moment. You need to use more sticks, slightly, less carrot. They want to hear what Mr. Witkoff says about his latest meeting with Putin and what he's prepared to do. And I think it's just a chance to get for the Europeans to sort of get that position over, just reinforce that message of putting more pressure on the Russians, but also saying, look, we don't see it in the same way you guys do. Whenever Mr. Witkoff is interviewed about this, he always sort of portrays this almost as a territorial dispute. That if only they could persuade the Ukrainians to give up a little bit of territory, maybe concede the sovereignty of the 4 or 5 oblasts, depending on your definition, that would somehow solve this problem. Whereas the Europeans have a different view. They say, no, this is about sovereignty. This is about the existence of Ukraine as a state and its ability to make its own decisions about how big its army should be, about what alliances it should have. And yes, it might have to concede temporarily on a temporary basis some kind of freezing of territorial loss, but somehow, the idea that there's some sort of land for peace deal out there is something the Europeans will try to squeezed back, I think.
And in terms of negotiations that are happening or were happening until recently, where have we actually got to with temporary ceasefires? And I know a deal was done on the Black Sea to a certain extent, but what about the rest?
Okay, well, there were two ceasefires allegedly sort of agreed, but not quite have agreed, which were, one was on an agreement that neither side would attack their energy infrastructure. That at least, I think, there's been some impact. I think that has shaped some of the targeting decisions made by both sides. Both sides have subsequently accused each other of breaching that. There's a bit of a muddle between, there's an obvious big attack on a big gas plant is one thing. Another attack that has led to the temporary loss of electrical power in a particular region because of an explosion somewhere that managed to hit. So both sides have accused each other, but there's perhaps been slightly less, targeting of those. On the Black Sea, there is no ceasefire because the Russians said they would only agree to it and only implement it if the US decided to remove some restrictions that the Russians believe are curbing their agriculture and fertilizer exports. As far as we know, we haven't seen any open movement by the Americans on that front. So at the moment, there is no formal ceasefire in the Black Sea. But anyway, there wasn't a great deal of military action there in the first place.
It's so fascinating, and diplomacy, and just seeing it play out in real time. And I suppose that's the maybe saying the word upside is not right, but one of the byproducts of the chaos that comes from the White House is that a lot of this stuff sort of happens out in the open as opposed to behind closed doors. So we can see the trade-offs being made in real time, or things being signed up to or not signed up to in real time. There's a parallel universe where this is done the old school way, and we don't know any of this. But the Ukrainians might prefer that.
Well, yeah, no, look, diplomacy is not always best done in public. Sometimes it is best done in private, where you can sort of smooth over the concessions and then present it publicly. Sometimes you do need to be public to put some leverage. I think what's really interesting is that the meetings today were clearly relatively last minute, was the impression I'm getting. There's not a great deal of news that's been emerging, and certainly there hasn't been much messaging beforehand. So all sides have been relatively restrained. So
it's quite old school then.
Yeah, well, it is. It, to a certain extent, is old school. Because what we've seen is been really interesting. The bulk of the meetings. I mean, obviously, there's been some headline stuff. President Macron, meeting the two Americans and having lunch, things like that. But a lot of the conversations have been with the national security advisors and the senior Sherpas and officials. People like Jonathan Powell, the UK National Security Advisor, his French and German equivalent. So these are technocrats. These are not politicians. These are people well versed in the diplomacy of seeking peace and forming coalition. If you think about it, Jonathan Powell, became famous as the guy helping Tony Blair to negotiate peace in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement. Since then, he spent a lot of time advising many sides on conflict resolution. This is the sort of stuff that he does. In other words, the conversations they're having are technocratic ones rather than sort of headline position ones, with a lot of politics, thrown on top.
I'm glad you mentioned the Good Friday Agreement, signed in 1998, because that is the subject of our first ever edition of Old Newscast, which is dropping on Good Friday. We sat down with Nick Watt and Anita McVeigh, our colleagues, to talk about that day in April 1998 when that agreement was signed and the consequences of it and the steps that led up to it.
How fantastic. I look forward to listening to it.
Where were you? What were you doing that?
I was a political reporter for the Times, so I covered it for the Times. Did Nick retell the story of that moment when Tony Blair arrives at the airport in Northern Ireland and says, "Now's not a time for sound bites"?
Yes.
He told that one. Good. Okay.
Well, hang on. There's another. We've discussed this before, though. There's an extra punchline, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a punchline. Yeah.
Anyway, people will have to listen to
They'll have to listen. I know it. I'm desperate to tell it, but I won't. I'll leave it to Nick.
What, though, I remember you and me stood outside Stormont, though, many years after the Good Friday Agreement, when the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Executive got up and running again with the so-called Chuckle Brothers.
Yeah.
And it was the last dying days of Tony Blair's premiership, and I'd been sent over for news round because Tony Blair's not going to be Prime Minister for much longer, and you were there covering the amazing politics that it was two people who no one thought would getting on very well.
Yeah.
Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness.
Well, I mean, look, what do we learn from that? That things can change. I think human beings are quite often conservative with a small c. We always assume that the status quo will remain like that forever, and that it is possible for conflict to change and become slightly less conflict-like. And, is that a note of hope for Ukraine that maybe it's possible that things can change over time? Who knows?
Well, and that moment you and I had outside Stormont was in 2007. So 9 years after the Good Friday Agreement had been signed. So a lot of time had passed. Oh, and actually, while we're on this subject, which old newscast would you like to do if we do these again? And it's up to the newscasters if we do.
Could you do Iraq?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I think obviously the big
2003.
the big moments for Iraq.
Well, you know what? Have a listen to this weekend's episodes. See if you like them. Let us know. And you can do that too when you're listening to them. But James, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. The next thing you'll hear will be our experiment of Old Newscast, where we'll be going back to April 1998 to talk about the Good Friday Agreement. And that episode will be dropping appropriately on Good Friday. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.